It is a pleasure, it is a privilege, and I'm grateful that Governor Jerry Brown has found the time to engage in today's conversation on politics in the nuclear age. Governor Brown's political career has been astonishing in terms of longevity, range, and impact. He was governor of California twice, both for 2 terms. And in between, he was a presidential candidate in the 1990s, the mayor of Oakland in the 2000s, and Attorney General of California into the 2010s. And that is more than the politician to Governor Brown. He's also devoted to the realm of ideas. More than 20 years ago, when he hosted the Oakland Table, we conducted 2 6-week-long seminars on and with the philosopher and social critic, Ivan Illich. About 10 years ago, he and I worked together to publish a set of essays on Illich called Beyond Economics and Ecology, for which he wrote the preface. Given that history and this moment in time, when war boils between powers bristling with nuclear weapons, who better to discuss politics in the nuclear age than Governor Jerry Brown, who not only chairs the California-China Climate Institute at UC Berkeley, but also serves as executive director of the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists. So, Governor Brown, I thought we could kick off this conversation by you perhaps telling us a little bit about the Bulletin, the context of its emergence, its purpose, and perhaps for the benefit of the younger ones in the audience, what the Doomsday Clock is all about.
Sure. A pleasure, Sajay, to be with you. I certainly recall the Oakland Table and the idea of going beyond mere think tankery to more practical, common sense approaches to ideas and current contemporary realities, both political and social. That was a remarkable period 20 years ago, and I hope people at some point research into exactly what we were doing at that Oakland Table. It was in Oakland, it was a table, and that indicated the kind of group discussion, the back and forth that we engaged in. Anyway, going to the idea of the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists, which is both an organization and a publication. Started way back in 1945, and it's been going ever since. It was created by some scientists who were connected to the design and building of the first atomic bomb. They were concerned with the power that they had let loose. And based on that, they wanted to wake people up through a journal of intellectual exchange and probing into the matters of both science and politics and technology that would follow as a result of this tremendous but awful scientific achievement. So the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists continues today with a group of, there's a number of aspects, but there's a science and security board made up of scientists, originally physicists, but now including biologists, epidemiologists, and others, looking at the danger, the horrors that modern technology has now made possible. Horrors first manifested by the dropping of the bomb on Hiroshima and then Nagasaki. That was the first horror, waking people up that humankind had developed the capacity to extinguish itself. That was the beginning.
Yes.
But it evolved also into other technologies. Well, not exactly a technology, but a climate change, global warming, the disruption to our climate pattern based on the generation of greenhouse gases, CO2, methane, soot, and other gases that are forming this blanket that is warming up a blanket metaphorically, but really a gaseous cover that is heating up the earth. So that's the second, climate. And then we have, of course, the virus, the pandemics that are caused by nature, caused by the interference of man with nature, and then possibly by terrorists as an intentional act of war. And then beyond that, we have cyber and the danger that can due to our infrastructure and the very basis of our economic civilization. And beyond that, we have space, artificial intelligence, all these things being militarized and weaponized in such a way that if they are utilized to their full capacity, the idea is, on the part of this Bulletin of Atomic Scientists, the extinction of humanity, or possibly something less than that, the unrecoverable collapse of civilization. So the stakes are high. The Doomsday Clock is an iconic presentation of through time, through a clock, counting on how close are we to doom? How close are we to the edge of utter catastrophe? And when it started, the clock was created in 1947 with the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists. It was on the cover then, and it was 7 minutes to doomsday, to midnight. Now it's 100 seconds, okay? A minute and 40 seconds. And that's all based on the tensions in the world, the capacity of certainly Russia and the United States to launch some kind of nuclear conflict, engagement that could spiral out of control. And of course, there are 7 other nuclear powers that can initiate not as many nuclear bombs by any means, but certainly France and Great Britain and England and France, India and Pakistan can certainly launch hundreds of nuclear weapons. And as we now know, that could have, there's the risk. There's some scientific, serious scientific debate, but there is a real possibility of what is called nuclear winter. That is, so much debris would be generated, would be stirred up by the landing of nuclear bombs on material, on buildings, on the ground, that the sun itself could be blocked for several years with no food growing. And that could be mass starvation involving billions. So the world, whether it's nuclear, whether it's climate, possibly to a lesser extent virus, but we don't know. The viruses are alive. They're mutated. Look how they spread. They're in one country, and then in a few days, they're thousands of miles away. So humankind, through the very tools, the techniques, the technologies of its own prosperity and creativity and invention, have now the power to terminate human life itself. So the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists and its Doomsday Clock is dedicated to awakening people. And I would have to say that for the most part, people are asleep. There's not this sense of doom that we had when Ronald Reagan was president and they had the television show the day after, showing what would happen the day after a nuclear exchange. Then the world really woke up. America woke up. So we're in a phase that we're a little more awake because of the horror of the Ukrainian war and the Russian invasion, and then the conflict back through the heroic Ukrainian fighters, and then America and Europe helping. But of course, this kind of conflict involves nuclear powers. And if it escalates to a point, one of them might start it. Once you start, the other may respond, and we're off to the races. Or I might say, it might be the end of the human race.
That makes for a one does not envy the work of the scientists who are monitoring the levels of threat that feed into establishing how far away from doom we are. But certainly from the list that you've enumerated, it's chilling and suggestive. And you're right, not everyone is aware of the extent to which, the extent of the dangers that face us. Principally.
Sajay, I want to interject a point here. No, the awareness level is very low, and as far as I can see, in talking to people, and that's natural to this extent that people don't want to think about doom. If you get a diagnosis of terminal cancer, I don't know how that you react to that. Denial is a big part of survival, and if we go around with the thought that in 5 minutes we could have a nuclear mushroom cloud in our neighborhood, that's pretty debilitating. So there is a normal denial, and the extent that you push it in people's face, they react. They tend to. The newspapers don't want to write about this. The danger of nuclear annihilation is not written about much.
Right.
It's too scary, too debilitating, and therefore we're in denial, which is very dangerous. The second thing I want to say is that this board, this Science and Security Board that is part of the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists Organization, I'm really impressed. I'm the executive chairman of that board, and I'm not a scientist, but they brought me in, I think, as somewhat of a megaphone and someone who can bring it to a broader public. But I'm very impressed with their seriousness, their lack of partisan aspects, partisan wrangling. I'm sure they have their biases like all human beings, but it's a very sober, deliberative, well-informed body of men and women. And I contrast that with my experience in politics, which obviously I like, I've been a part of. It's a part of me. But boy, the deceptions or the obfuscations, the game playing, the posturing of politics is really at contrast to the way I see these scientists deliberate on man's fate.
Which I think leads me to the two points that flow from what you've just said. One, the scale of the threats we face and the tendency for at least ordinary people, many people, to bury their head in the sand when having to contemplate such enormous devastation and devastating consequences. And on the other hand, the role of the scientists to inform at least the political leaders, the people who can, in fact, make decisions. So times of great peril call for times of great leadership. And I'm reminded of the essay that you just published in the New York Review of Books that carried the title Washington's Crackpot Realism, which was a very sobering account, to take a phrase that you just, a word that you just used, a sobering account of the sort of leadership we have. And I wondered if you might explain a little more what the idea behind crackpot realism is, or what that term refers to, and what you intended to say in that essay. For those who haven't read it, I hope.
I'll start off by saying I do want to commend President Biden for two things: for getting out of the war in Afghanistan after 20 terrible years, and number two, not joining the war directly against Russia in the Ukraine, certainly supplying arms and things, but not trying to do a no-fly zone and start shooting down Russian planes. That would be the engagement of two nuclear powers, profoundly dangerous. So that's a good posture that he's presented. Now, having said that, I want to put President Biden in the flow of the previous presidents, Trump, Obama, Bush, Clinton, and before that. Okay, now the term crackpot realism is not original with me. It was first coined, I believe, by C. Wright Mills. He wrote a book in 1958 that sold 100,000 copies. Its title was The Causes of World War III. It was really, in some sense, a pamphlet against war and the danger of the awful Third World War that he envisions. Okay, crackpot realism was to call out the people in Washington who fancy themselves as tough-minded, as realist. That the people in Washington like to think they're tough-minded. They're not utopian. They're not naive or romantic. But he said, in fact, that they're crackpot because they're playing with such dangerous tools, technology, policy, ideas, engagements. That's where we are. And it's today, but it's been going on a long time. And I think in 1958, what he might have been thinking about was the nuclear doctrine of the United States of America, which was massive retaliation. That's the way it was. Yeah. And the point at that point, the belief was Soviet Union had troops and could go right through into Germany and demolish the NATO defense. In order to block that, because they didn't want to spend all the money on more and more soldiers, it was to use nuclear bombs. And the doctrine was massive. What does massive mean? Well, the Joint Chiefs of Staff met a few years after C. Wright Mills coined the phrase crackpot realism, and they met and they formulated in secret what is called PSYOP 62. It was 61, and it became 62 after 1962. And this was under Eisenhower, but the PSYOP, the single integrated operational plan, aimed and had a detailed targeting plan, focusing many places, cities in China, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Eastern Europe, and Russia. And the 3,300 nuclear bombs to be launched would result, according to the analyst who was there at the time with the Pentagon, Dan Ellsberg, in about 600 million people dying. Today we know that it could result in billions if the nuclear winter scenario proved out. So that's if that was going on, it was going on. So that's going on in the 1950s. It's the age of Eisenhower. It's the placid, non-polarized, non-political time. Leave it to Beaver is on the television screen. It's the hit parade is a very kind of normality, as it were. But in the face of that normality, the leadership, the scientists, the Pentagon, the political people, same thing going on in Moscow, by the way, are preparing the basis for annihilating hundreds of millions of human beings and whatever biological disaster that entails. That is insane, and that's why it's called crackpot, and we still live within that crackpot, the crackpot dimension. And I want to say, it's not just nuclear weaponry. Each year, the Stockholm Institute for Peace studies arms sales. Now, the number one arms salesman is the USA, United States of America. Number two, Russia, and then you got France, and down the line you got China. I think it's number 6. Anyway, the sale of weapons, tools, machines to create suffering, unimaginable suffering and death. The total amount is between about 950 billion, just under 1 trillion on an annual basis. This is what the leaders of the world of so many countries are engaging in, because not only are those weapons sold, but they're bought eagerly and they're made ready to use. So at the same time, we're readying Armageddon at various levels, small and large. We have the onrush of climate change, which is going to require $1 trillion a year at least of adaptation and mitigation. We have, for example, in America, you've got a couple 100 million gas vehicles. In the world, you have 600 or 700 million. Okay, so you have several hundred million in America. Those have to come off the road. To come off the road, then people aren't just going to give them up. The government's going to have to help buy that, and going to have to help create zero emission vehicles. You can see trillions there, and then go on to the whole plan of stabilizing the climate. That's just one thing. Then you got the virus. You got many other things. You got poverty. You got so many things going on, and the fact that our perceptions, our actions are so distorted. When I say I'm talking globally. And we can see whatever privilege we have here in this country, but that's the point of crackpot realism. Things look okay and are okay for many people, but we're only seconds away from doom. And that's why the Doomsday Clock is 1 minute, 40 seconds away from the end.
Governor Brown, it seems to me that it's interesting, perhaps, that Robert McNamara, who was, I would suspect, would have fit the bill of that title of that phrase when C. Wright Mills was writing it, seems to have had a change of heart. In 2005, in the Foreign Policy Journal, he wrote an essay titled Apocalypse Soon. And it was an impassioned and clearly argued piece against, calling for the systematic disarmament and de-escalation and removal of nuclear war, machines of tools of nuclear war. And I just wanted to quote one line, which would perhaps we can talk through a little bit later. He writes, to declare war of the U.S. Constitution, to declare war requires an act of Congress, but to launch a nuclear holocaust requires 20 minutes deliberation by the president and his advisors. And he continued to say this was the case 40 years ago, and it remains the case today. Pointing to the divorce, if you want, or the speed, the urgency, the state of emergency created by a certain class of tools, in this case, nuclear weapons. You don't have the time to deliberate. We have to act. And therefore, tendentially, politics gets sucked up into a kind of presidential politics rather than government by the people. I wonder what your take is on the consequences of nuclear weapons on democratic politics.
Well, just look at that one idea of PSYOP 62, the strategic integrated plan to launch more than 3,000 nuclear weapons if Russia launched them toward us. By the way, there can be mistakes in the perception of whether those are really weapons that have been launched. There have been very close calls where the United States thought Bill Perry, Secretary of Defense, whom I know, I've discussed with him when he was, his experience of being woken up in the middle of the night, said hundreds of Russian missiles are coming our way. We have to fire back. He said, no, don't do that. I think it's not going to be real. And so because we were at peace, a much better relationship with Russia, he called a halt to that. The Russians, on the other hand, they thought America had launched several hundred nuclear weapons. They turned out to be birds or something. They got caught up in the radar. So there's a danger that not only can one man, the president, or one woman, the case may be, launch the war without going to Congress, they can do it under false pretenses, under mistake. And that's why William Perry, the Secretary of Defense under Bill Clinton, talks about nuclear blunder. For years, especially under Eisenhower and Kennedy, the fear was bolt out of the blue that Russia would do a preemptive strike and take out our nuclear weapons, and we couldn't do anything about it. So we had to build second strike capacity of enormous dimension in order to deter that. But as Bill Perry now says, the great threat is blunder or mistake, miscalculation. So it's not a bolt out of the blue. They're getting ready to preempt us, but it's a mistake. And then we launch, or the Russians launch, and then the horror ensues. Yes, it is one man, one person. Right now, it's Putin. He can decide that. I don't know how many people he's got to check with, probably nobody. Same thing with Biden. Biden wants to go call Strategic Command over there in Omaha. He can launch it. In fact, Bill Perry, with another individual, wrote a book called The Button. One guy's got his finger on the button. So to say it's the people is not true. It is not the people. It's one person, and one person in charge of unimaginable power. And by the way, the PSYOP 62 that I mentioned, that wasn't debated in Congress. It was absolute secrecy. So that is a paradox, and I would even say a contradiction in the notion that it is we the people. No, it is he, the person, the man or woman, right now it's Biden, and it's Mr. Putin, or over there in France. I don't know what their system is. I'm sure Modi in India has got his finger on the button. He can launch on India anytime he wants. So there's where we are. It is a deep contradiction to democratic assumptions. And it ought to tell us that our notion that we live in an age of democracy, power to the people, has been canceled by the power that has now been created by human beings. Yes, we do have a lot of freedoms, a lot of opportunity. In America, we have so many benefits, but we're locked into this dark power. I'd even say satanic power, if I wanted to get more graphic here. And it's a satanic power that is shared and is probably being envied by several other countries who are worried about their own security. So through insecurity, we magnify insecurity by the bombs that we, and I'd say bombs, they're far more sophisticated than mere bombs. But yeah, people are after security, and by so doing, they create absolute insecurity.
I'd like to pull on two threads. One, reaffirming what you just said about the slow but decisive enfeeblement, if not corruption, of the idea of democracy was suggested in the context of nuclear weapons and the bomb by the historian you know well, Gary Wills. He wrote this book some years ago titled Bomb Power, where he makes the point that the entire constitutional setup, which requires the deliberative expression of the people through their representatives, is precisely, as you said, put into abeyance, in part because of the emergencies created by the scale of this thing, that all power begins to concentrate in the president's hand, in here. But every country, as you say, in India, in Modi, the prime minister's hand, whoever is the final authority to decide. So one person or a few people are given the awesome responsibility to hold in balance the lives of millions. And Gary Wills makes this point that as a consequence, over these years, there has been a cult of the commander-in-chief. There's a growing secrecy and security state where over time, the practice of democratic politics has gotten enfeebled. I wondered, so this is the second line to follow. I wondered whether or not there is an impact on intensifying the management of people's sentiments or people's perception or public opinion in such a circumstance. When people get more and more enfeebled with respect to self-government, then perception management or sentiment management or public opinion becomes even more of...
So you're asking whether the people's opinions are being manipulated in the service of, I guess, securing the nuclear power in the hands of the president, or manufacturing consent, as Noam Chomsky put in his book, or manipulating public opinion, or in some way trying to control or distort the thinking of citizens. And yeah, well, that's obviously going on in many ways. In the private sector, it's advertising. In the public sector, it's the promotion of security and security values. And with I don't know, it's the possession of the nuclear bomb that causes government to want to control people's thinking. But I would say the fear that generates the bomb. We're afraid of the Soviet Union. We're afraid of the Russians. The Indians are afraid of the Pakistanis and vice versa. Therefore, they build the bomb. Once you build the bomb, your fear intensifies. Now, with all that fear, does government, by that means, want to control people so they don't do anything stupid or outrageous? I don't know about what I think is that the bomb business is secret. And the secrecy is contrary to democracy. And yes, at the same time, there's a lot of opinion formation. For example, in the Iraq War, all the New York Times, the Washington Post, the leaders of the Senate and the House, they all went along with it. And if you spoke against the war in Iraq, you were marginalized. You were thought of as somehow unpatriotic. And France, because France opposed the war, they wanted didn't even want to say French fries. They want to say patriotic fries or something. I think it got ridiculous, but it's an indication that the herd mentality, the movement of people gathering together and moving in a certain direction, That's the way it is. And I'd have to say even the leaders themselves are manipulated because they're looking out at the world from a point of view of fear and also a point of view of strength and a point of view of having the power to blow everything up. And Putin is seeing it the same way as Xi and others in the world. So humankind is at the point where its normal rivalries and distortions are now linked with awful consequences. So that's what we have to think about. Now, public opinion, you raised the point, is it being manipulated? Public opinion is shaped by so many different factors. Certainly advertising is a big piece, but the Pentagon puts out their press releases. The generals are on CNN, the retired generals, the folk who prepare for these wars go into think tanks, and then think tanks provide the talking heads, and away it goes. So in that sense, you could do a whole study here of how the public opinion is formed. Certainly, Putin is trying to say he's not even at war. He's trying to control and manipulate Russia. We'll see if he can get away with that. Now, in America, we have a very different form of opinion management, but nevertheless, it's not what you'd call wide-ranging, divergent thinking with a real clashing of ideas in open debate. Things in times of crisis tend to narrow. We rally behind the flag. It's not a time for academic inquiry, unfortunately.
And I think the way Gary Wills tried to argue the point was to say that, look, nuclear weapons are an instance of technological objects that are of such magnitude and such technical difficulty that ordinary people can't get involved and they get excluded, and thus creating the separation between government by the people as opposed to government for the people, or government of the people. We have to govern the people rather than get them involved in self-government. And making this point, sorry, go ahead.
Well, as you can say, that's true. I want to affirm your point there that with the tools, which are far more than tools, they're systems of vast power and complexity. And because of that, ordinary people can't enter into that dimension, that domain of decision making that is reserved to experts and very few experts that are highly selected, credentialed, and prepared for this awful role of holding the fate of the world in their hand.
Governor Brown, what I'd like to do now is to take up the point that Gary Wills makes in Bomb Power and extend it a little more. We've spoken already about the enfeeblement of democratic politics because of the scale of these technologies, that because of their complexity, requirement for secrecy, requirement for speed, separate out the people from the actual practices of government. We've also spoken as a consequence, another consequence is managing public opinion of those who are not involved in the practice of government. So government by the people becomes replaced more or less by government of the people. And what I'd like to point out now is Elaine Scarry in Thermonuclear Monarchy insists upon the need to see these clearly in opposition. That is to say, on the one hand, you have the choice to stay with this kind of regime of absolute emergency based on nuclear weapons versus democratic or constitutional republics. The two cannot coexist. But here's the curiosity or the interesting feature of her book. She makes a long and detailed argument for how to recover politics from the maw of technology gone wild by insisting upon two constitutional principles, US constitutional principles. One, that Congress has the exclusive and sole authority to declare war. So everything done in non-congressional ways are really unconstitutional. And second, she also adduces the Second Amendment as evidence of a people who are allowed to defend themselves. So if there's harm done to anyone, they have the absolute authority, the right to defend themselves. And using these two constitutional principles to push back against the nuclear state. Of course, it will require international agreements and so on, but these are the domestic constitutional principles by which one could regain a semblance of constitutional republics. And I wonder what your thought might be on that. Or is
well, first of all, I do want to make an observation. You said of the people. I think it's really we want it to be of the people or by the people, but it really is for the people in the sense that the people are like children, and the government and the leadership are running the show. They're like daddy, and there it is.
Yeah.
So, and that's true because it's so complicated, and because of all the danger, it's also secret, and it's in the hands of very few people and outside public scrutiny. So that's not democratic control, and it doesn't look like you're going to be able to control that. Now, her idea that we have a constitution that says that only Congress declares the war. Well, Congress didn't declare the war in Korea. It doesn't declare a lot of these wars. There's not really. And when there was a debate about invading Iraq, it was pretty cursory. It wasn't. It was based on distorted, deeply distorted information or so-called intelligence about the weapons of mass destruction. And the paper and many think tank and people, they all cheerleaded this invasion. So it was not a thoughtful discourse. So the idea that you're going to have Congress do a better job than the president, I think is not realistic. It's not my experience of the legislative branch, of which I've had decades of multiple thousands of encounters. So we are in a dilemma here. The dilemma, it's one of the dilemma, is a dangerous precipice on which humanity is now on. And invoking the Second Amendment, the right to bear arms, or the constitutional provision of Congress declaring war, that's not going to take us anywhere, I'm sorry to say. Bill Perry wrote the book, The Button, where he said we shouldn't have one finger on the button. The president should have to consult people. That idea is going nowhere. And many good thinkers don't even know how you do that because you have to respond to nuclear war in a matter of minutes. And with these new hypersonic missiles, you only have 10 minutes. And if the Russians put a submarine out in the Atlantic, a couple hundred miles away, you'll have less than 5 minutes. So we're in a very dangerous position, and there's only one answer forward. Our leaders, as uncontrolled as they are by the people, have to get some kind of a awakening and start building trust. And we're talking about trust with people like Putin and Xi. And if you say, we can't do that, well, we can't do that, then the risk, hopefully they'll die off or get replaced, and we'll find somebody who will. But that doesn't sound too comforting. There's a guy at Oxford, Toby Ord, he wrote a book called The Precipice. And in that book, he was more worried about artificial intelligence than nuclear war. I don't agree with that, but that's what he said. Anyway, he said we got about a 1 in 6 chance, we, the 8 billion people in humanity in the world, of avoiding the unrecoverable collapse of civilization. We're in deep trouble, deep doo-doo. I want to say something else, but I won't. So this is the position we're in. And if you're a religious person, you can pray. If you're not, I guess you can hope. You can write your essays, whatever you can do. But we're still alive. We're still in the game. But it's getting more dangerous. And the way out is not some new constitutional provision, which I don't believe is going to happen. It's going to have to be the building of trust across nationalistic divides. And if that's viewed as crackpot, well, then we're cooked. So we need a path forward based on wisdom and slow, incremental, verifiable trust. That's the only way we can do it. And I'm not saying that'll work. I'm not even saying we can try it. But the opposite is called deterrence. And deterrence means threats. I threaten you. And by the way, since I'm not sure the threat's working, I'm going to intensify the threat with more weapons, with more technology. And that's what's going on. That's called the arms race. And it's going on among many countries, but primarily Russia, China, and the US. So we got lots of issues ahead. And I think it does call for sober reflection, disciplined study, and all of us doing whatever we can to bring a bit of enlightenment to the human dimension.
Governor Brown, thank you very much. While we started off this conversation in the context of Mary Gage's play Fallout, which is about nuclear weapons, as a way of bringing awareness among people to the scale of things that you're talking about. Let's hope that your call for planetary realism, which is the alternative to crackpot realism, a plea for sober cooperation among people who are and trust building, so that we walk away from the precipice, comes to some fruition. Thank you for your time. Thank you for your considered remarks, and we will pray and hope. Thank you again.
Sure. My pleasure.